Hey everyone, thanks so much for coming. I really appreciate the turnout. This is people really care and love children. That's why you're here, and I am really excited for you. For those of you in the overflow, hello. If you appreciate being able to watch this, if you're in the overflow, you need to thank Rob Willis. He worked incredibly hard, and so did the staff of the media center. Can y'all give them a hand? They really worked hard to be able to make this happen. And so for those of you in the overflow, we're happy to have you along with us, but of course you get no free lunch. Sorry, you didn't sign up in time. But I want to start off with just to introduce to you one of the special guests. We have many special guests here, but I want to introduce Rod Marshall to you. He's going to present a little bit about Alabama Baptist Children's Home. They are our sponsor of the event. We really appreciate them being here. As you may have seen, our own Riley Green has been out there, and Jonathan Good, they're manning the booth, and we're happy to have them with us. Rod Marshall began working with Alabama Baptist Children's Homes and Family Ministries in 1995 and has been serving as president and CEO for the past 2 years. Rod earned a BA from Samford in Religion, Human Relations. He has an MA and an EDS in Agency Counseling from UAB. He's currently a student at Regent University, where he's working toward a PhD in counselor education and supervision. Rod's been working in the mental health field for more than 20 years in diverse settings, including hospitals, residential treatment settings, community mental health agencies, therapeutic foster care, and private practice. For much of his career, he specialized in working with children and families. Rod's been married since 1988. He's a proud father of 2 young adult children. He and his family are his family, he only has one, I assume. They're members of Shadescrest Baptist Church in Birmingham, Alabama. Please welcome Rod Marshall. He's going to share with us about Alabama Baptist Children's Home. Thank you so much.
Thank you, David. What a privilege it is to be with you this morning and to participate in this great event. I want to tell you a little bit about the Alabama Baptist Children's Homes. We've been around quite a while. Almost 125 years. We've seen a lot change in that time, from being a traditional southern orphanage that was actually a working dairy farm to becoming a statewide ministry. We currently have 6 group homes which provide long-term care for children in need of care. We have 2 emergency shelters that provide short-term group homes for kids in need of care. We have about 100 foster homes all throughout the state. We have 36 counseling centers where we serve the children in our care as well as families in need. And we have 4 homes that are family care homes for homeless mothers and their children, where they can stay for up to a year, where they are discipled and mentored and move toward independence. Our purpose is to protect, nurture, and restore children and families through Christ-centered services. According to the Department of Human Resources in the state of Alabama, there's 6,400 children in our foster care system. However, the population of the state of Alabama is a little over 4 million, and 1 out of every 4 describes themselves as a Christian. So if we have 1 million Christians in this state and 6,400 children in need of care, I think it's inexcusable that any child would ever be placed in a home that is not a home that's called to the ministry of Christian foster care and that will work with those children because they see those children being created in the image of God, and they strive to be a father to the fatherless as God has taught us to be. Nationwide, there are almost 400,000 children in our foster care system. Again, I would say there's plenty of Christians. If 1% of Christians took the needs of foster children seriously, the other 99% could ignore those needs, and we'd still be able to meet every need. If every church, every congregation took care of 1 child, we would solve the problem of fatherlessness in our country literally overnight. It's not that we need 50% buy-in or 20% buy-in or 10% buy-in. We just need those folks who are responsive to the call to care for orphans, 1 or 2 or 3%, and we'd start running out of fatherless before we would run out of folks who want to take care of those fatherless. Here in Alabama, we're trying to do that through the Alabama Baptist Children's Home and other faith-based foster care ministries and child care ministries. And our desire is to see a time where every child has the opportunity to hear the gospel and to see the gospel and to be loved unconditionally, to be accepted, to be taken from a hard place and brought into a safe place. So we're so glad to be here today and glad you are all here and looking forward to hearing from our panel.
All right. Thank you so much, Rod. Okay, now I'd like to draw your attention to some of the flyers that are in front of you. For those of you in the Samford community, your faculty, staff, or student, I want you to know about missiography. What is missiography? It's missions photography. Basically, it's an event we're going to have during World Christianity Focus Week where I'm taking entries. We're not going to print all of them, but I'm taking entries from you, pictures that you have taken while on mission in another country, things that really display either world Christianity or a global need in a poignant way, artistic way if possible. And we're going to print those, we're going to blow them up, and during that week, we're going to be showing them in the Divinity School. A couple other places on campus will have them, but then after that week, the library is going to display the best of for about a month. So I'm really excited to take this opportunity to really just reflect what so many of you are doing throughout the world. Also, World Christianity Focus Week itself. We're going to have Doug Birdsall here. Doug Birdsall was the leader of Lausanne just a few years ago, 2010, when they met in Cape Town, South Africa. Some of you aren't familiar with Lausanne. I want you to understand this is a really big deal. This is a major gathering of global leaders. As a matter of fact, this last one was the most ecumenical and diverse gathering of any Protestant evangelical leadership in history. And he was the leader here, and he's going to give us some insight as to what it was like, what he learned, and just be able to talk about world Christianity. He'll be speaking in our chapel. It's going to be April 8th at 11 a.m. I would love to have you here with us. Now, time to introduce our speakers. Dr. Rick Morton. Raise your hand, Doc. All right. He is Associate Pastor for Discipleship and Equipping at Faith Baptist Church in Bartlett, Tennessee. He's married to Denise, and they are the parents of Nick, Eric, and Nastia, all adopted from Ukraine. Together, the Mortons were part of a co-founding of Promise 139, an international orphan hosting ministry based in Hattiesburg. In addition to the local church ministry, Morton has spent more than a decade as a college and seminary professor. Most recently, he served on the faculty of his alma mater, New Orleans Baptist Theological Seminary, as an associate professor of Christian education. Before joining the faculty at New Orleans, Rick taught on the faculties of both Bryan College and the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary. Morton is a frequent youth ministry conference leader and an author with numerous youth ministry publications to his credit. And I just found out that we have some really strong ties with my former organization, Youth Ministry International. So go, Rick. All right. Mark Ottinger. All right. Mark was born and raised in Dalton, Georgia, and attended a college in Atlanta at Georgia Tech, where he played on the tennis team, and he was involved in Campus Crusade for Christ. Johnny originally asked me if he could be on the panel, basically giving me his, some of his qualifications, and he mentioned tennis, and he loves coffee. I'm like, did you really have to ask me? I mean, of course. So after graduation, he moved to Denton, Texas, to be part of discipleship program under Tommy Nelson. Mark spent 4 years in Texas, serving 3 years on the staff of the college ministry Denton Bible Church, graduating from Dallas Theological Seminary, and marrying his lovely wife, Tona. Is that spelled right? Yeah. Tona? Okay, making sure. Mark came on staff with fellowship of our First Family Ministry pastor in November of 2010. His ministry includes providing leadership for Fellowship Kids, Children's Ministry, and Engage 1.17, Adoption Foster Care Ministry, and investing in his marriage. David Hennessy. All right. David left his professional career in 2005 to bring his business knowledge to international ministry. David believes that combining passion for orphan care with a focus on ministry excellence creates profound impact for the fatherless. It's with this focus on ministry excellence that it's with this conviction that he desires to inspire, encourage, and enable churches and ministries around the world to serve orphans to their best ability, ultimately bringing glory to Jesus Christ. David's wife Lisa and 5 girls, Kristen, Sasha, Aaron, Lauren, and Megan, have been very supportive of this move and personally served in Ukraine for 6 summers. Through their Youth Reach international efforts, the Hennessy's met Sasha while living in Russia. They were immensely blessed to be able to adopt her in the summer of 2008. Their family continues to be involved in orphan ministry within their church, and several of their children desire to return to the mission field one day to serve the fatherless. Prior to this role, David served as executive director for Youth Reach International, an orphan mentoring ministry serving in Eastern Europe. In this position, he pioneered an orphan mentoring program using indigenous volunteers encourage U.S. and international churches to support orphan care efforts and streamline operations for the ministry. Previously, David served as Director of Professional Services for ScanSource, a barcode and wireless data collection distributor helping usher new technologies into a value-added reseller market. Johnny Grimes. Now, Johnny sent me bios for everyone else but him, so I get to say what I want. All right. All right, first thing you need to know about Johnny is that he grew up with the tremendous advantage of having the best youth minister in America named David Parks. All right. And now some of you are thinking, okay, this is nepotism. That's the only reason he's here. And well, that's right. Okay. Johnny, he graduated with a bachelor's and master's at New Orleans Seminary. His background includes church planning, and he's been the director for Altar 84 for over a year now. He's married to Courtney. They're one cool tattooed couple. They have 2 children, River and Penn, who's adopted from Ethiopia. Altar 84 is committed to educating and resourcing the church to do the work of orphan care. Altar 84 exists to alter. I just said that. We're committed to offer all that He has given to us, our lives, our resources, our talents, to increase awareness to the orphan crisis and our call to care through the word and action. We really appreciate Altar 84 being here and for bringing these great speakers in. And so let me give you a little bit of an overview of how this is going to work. Originally, I was thinking we would just kind of have open question and answer. But then when we filled up and we already had everyone's information, email address, decided to send out questions ahead of time. And so we already have those set. If we get to the end and if there's time for you to ask specific follow-up questions that are related to what they talked about, then please do. But for now, we're just going to have the format where I'm asking them the questions. They will go back and forth, and then we'll move on to the next question. So let me pray for us, then we're going to get started. Lord Jesus, thank you so much for your mercy in our lives. Thank you that you have loved us, you've called us, and you've adopted us into your kingdom. Lord, thank you for your grace and the privilege of being involved to help the needs of the world. The widow, the orphan, for all the hurting. God, I just lift up this time. I ask that it would be helpful. There's many people here are here because it's not theory. It's what they do. It's their heart, their passion. So Lord, we just pray we'd honor you and that it would be very helpful. So in Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Okay, everyone. Question number 1. Who is an orphan?
We probably could take the rest of the time that we're going to be here and break down that definition. And truly, I think that's one of the things that we've struggled with as a movement, and struggle with in the church as we try to figure out how to respond to the crisis. One of the things that I've started to do even as I try to talk about and try to help the church figure out how to respond is use the term orphans and vulnerable children, and kind of use those boxcar together because I think as we think about it theologically, when we look at what the Bible talks about as an orphan, orphan in our context, when we think about it in English, we think about a child that has no parents. In the Bible, orphan is a child that's vulnerable based upon the loss of a father. And so this is a child that has vulnerability because of his or her social place. When we look at the world we live in, there are the complexity of who the orphan population is immense. The number that we hear thrown around most of the time in our circles is that there are 153 million orphans in the world. That number is a number that's given to us by UNICEF. The truth is that number of children in the world are children that have lost one or both parents due to death. the usefulness of that number is, and the reason that UNICEF even created that number is to basically to awaken the world to the AIDS crisis, and was to help the world to understand the vulnerability of children around the world to AIDS. So these were essentially children who had lost a parent or had lost both parents to AIDS, and to help us understand how dire the situation was if we didn't confront the AIDS crisis. What it doesn't help us to understand is the number of children that are in institutions because of social circumstances, kids that have been given up because of indifference, kids that have been given up because of poverty, kids that have been given up because of disease. It doesn't help us to deal with children who are street children. The complexity of that situation is immense, because in the eyes of the state, they don't exist. And so the simplistic solutions that we talk about oftentimes in things like adoption, those children are beyond the reach of things like adoption because they don't exist. There's no paper that exists on them, so they can't be adopted. And so when you ask the question about who an orphan is, and you begin to tease out the complexity of what that means worldwide, never mind the fact that there are people that are your friends and my friends who are single parents, who have children that are living in their home and they're doing very well, and they fit into that 153 million orphan number. And so fairly, they're not in need of the same sort of ministry that vulnerable children that are hanging in the balance around the world need. And so we really have to begin to think differently, holistically, because according to God's Word, those children are our responsibility. And God has asked us to do something, and God's asked us to do something very pointedly on His behalf, because as He introduces Himself to the world, He says that He's the father to the fatherless, and He's the defender of the defenseless, and as He presents Himself and as He calls His people out, us, the church, He calls us out to join Him in that work.
Okay, anybody else have anything to add?
Rick says you had talked about kids who've lost their father.
Yeah.
And typically that really means that they've lost the provision and protection of somebody. So one of the things that I look at is are they a child who does not have provision and protection right now? And that can, they may have parents, they may not have parents. It's really up in the air. I think we need to look at the heart of really what God wants us to apply. And then you have the other opportunity of talking all about spiritual orphans, people who are really separated from their Heavenly Father, of which we all were at one point. But I think for the purposes of this discussion, we're more talking about those that have lost their provision and protection of a parent.
Yeah.
Which I will say, being a pastor of a church, and this may be going on a little tangent, and I know orphan is a biblical word, but when you sit with a birth mom who is trying to make a decision, is she going to make an adoption plan? She doesn't want her child to be called an orphan. And I think we within the church community and a lot that we've done, I mean, we go around saying orphan, orphan, orphan. I mean, I've got 4 children through adoption, and I'll never forget the ride home one Sunday after church when my daughter said, "Dad, am I an orphan?" And you know, I just think we got to be wise with this word, and we as church and you guys as future leaders within your church, we just need to be wise with how we throw it around.
Good word. Okay, give me just a brief sketch. What are the different options for orphan care?
Well, locally, and I'm just talking vulnerable children. That is my, I would say my area that I've really developed a heart for, and so when we say orphan care, I mean I move it more toward the foster care or supporting adoptive families, and man, that is immense and that is exhaustive as well of what we could get involved in. I mean, they shared the numbers of the amount of children that are in foster care. But you can expand that and say, how do we keep children out of foster care? Where does the church need to dive in and try to keep families together? And once families are separated, then how do you come along? Do you need to foster? Do you need to support a foster family? Do you need to provide respite? Do you need to? You can go on and on. 3% of children that are in foster care will ever go to college and graduate. So, in Memphis, where Rick and I are from, 100% of the children that age out of foster care will become homeless, because in Shelby County, we have no plan for them once they reach the age of 18. There's no transitional living. They're not able to go into college. So it's immense. So, that from a local standpoint, you can dive in all over the place.
Yeah. I think, I think if you're kind of looking at a continuum, prevention is a place to start. Things that we don't talk about a lot, like economic development, those sorts of things are incredibly important, but they're not talked about a lot in our circles. But that's a part of the equation. Reunification. We're called to the ministry of reconciliation, and part of the inherent reflection of the gospel in what we do, bringing the gospel to bear, is there are families where the potential exists for brokenness to be healed, and for children to be restored with their birth parents. And if we're going to be honest about the way we do this, then we have to be honest about the fact that we have a responsibility to minister to those parents as much as we have a responsibility to minister to the children, and we have to step into that world, and we have to bring the gospel to bear there as well. And so reunification, and that's largely an unexplored theme in much of what we're doing. It's a weakness in the Christian orphan care and adoption movement. I think then, there's, obviously adoption, and, we've said that word about 1 million times already, and that is, we don't want to say that that's not a part of the equation. Foster care, in-home care, family-based care, and I'm not gonna be shy about telling you that I think home-based care is superior in many cases. That's a broad generalization. I'm also not going to tell you that there are not times where institutions are appropriate. There are times when, and that may be a sense of urgency because of the circumstance, great tragedy, but it may also be because of the needs of a child that institutionalization is appropriate. But it's not a long-term solution.
Tell you what, you're getting a little bit ahead of me, so let me go ahead and ask this next question because you're already kind of answering it. Okay. So the next question is, best practices, benchmarks, and similar means are used to establish goals and measure success in much of the profit sector. Orphan care, however, involves many types of organizations with broad ranges of missions. So a best practice among one segment of orphan care may result in failure in another segment. What are some ways of determining the best care for orphans in various settings? And the next question that goes along with that, is there a progression of first/best option to a last option?
I won't do answering that question justice, so I'm going to lean on these men to answer that one. But I will say this, that the challenge that we face as a movement is really helping educate our churches and the people that are involved in this movement in actually what orphan care is. And orphan care goes far beyond adoption. And that's the challenge which we face, especially in churches, is like, well, we're passionate about orphan care. Oh, yeah, you're passionate about adoption. Well, no, not, yes and no. Orphan care is so much more than adoption, and I think these men have said that. Orphan care is so many different things, and again, it's to speak to the second part of that question, is there a progression, first best options to last options? I would say absolutely. I would say that if we are passionate about serving the orphans, say globally, we want to have an impact in a country like Haiti or a country like Ethiopia, where we know that there are large numbers of orphans. I would say the progression for me, and some men may disagree with this, but the progression for me is that if we want to come in and have significant impact in an area, if we want to do orphan care ministry that's holistic in nature and that approaches it with this mindset, what's best for this child, if you keep that in your mind, then I would say that we as individuals, as Christians, and as organizations need to say, all right, our first objective is family preservation. How can we set up processes and systems that is going to equip these families to be able to care for their own children? And but then we move from that and say, okay, well, there's not a best option for this specific child. Family preservation is not an option. Then let's try to advocate on behalf of having this child adopted in country. All right? Is there a distant relative that would be willing and able, now that's important, willing and able to provide the necessary love, support, protection, and care that this child needs? If so, then how can we encourage, foster, support that? That very well may not be an option, and then we would move to something that is the best option for this child, international adoption. And so to tag on to what Rick said, and then these guys could speak to it, adoption is not the only solution. It's a part of the solution. I would look at it as orphan care is a pretty complex, difficult, and sometimes complicated puzzle. And adoption is one piece of the puzzle. I've heard Rick say many times is that the vast majority of the orphans and vulnerable in the world, the vast majority of them cannot be adopted. So the question is, as a movement and as the church, what are we going to do with the rest? We have to, yes, I think it's important that we advocate for adoption. My families have adopted. We are advocates of adoption, but that is one piece of the puzzle. So I think there is a progression. I think we just need to go into serving the world's vulnerable and the orphan with the mindset, what's best for the child, what promotes holistic care, and essentially what is God-honoring and God-glorifying.
Yeah, Rick had talked about this continuum. So you have in terms of housing and care for orphans around the world, you have this continuum from institutionalization all the way to family-based care. And in between that, there are children's homes, group homes, fostering situations, smaller family-based care, and ultimately getting to a child being in a family with a mom and a dad. I would go back to the scripture where God, who when he says he's father to the fatherless, he says God sets the lonely in families. He does not set the lonely in orphanages. That doesn't mean that's the ideal. That doesn't mean it's always practical or able to do that in every single situation. There are particular crises that happen around the world where temporary institutionalization of children are absolutely necessary. And there are other situations with depending on the needs of the child where that is absolutely necessary. But can we have a mindset of looking at the ideal in the long run and moving towards that? And I think we see a trending of that within the orphan care movement and within orphan care practitioners. Beyond that, if all we're talking about is where does a kid live and who provides the food and the shelter, I think we're missing out on a whole lot. Most institutions can provide food, shelter, clothing, education, and most of those institutions are run by governments and NGOs, and they can marshal all of that together very, very well, but they can't provide the love and nurture that only a mom and a dad can really provide. But beyond that, when we talk about a lot of these orphanages all around the world, up to 80% of the kids that are living in those orphanages are social orphans, which means they have a mom or a dad that can't take care of them for whatever reason. Maybe incarceration or addictions or poverty or whatever. What do we do with those kids? So where is the church in response to that? I'm a huge advocate of mentoring, a huge advocate of believers going in and mentoring children and being that big brother, big sister friend that they so desperately need that is not necessarily, can't be provided en masse to the kids that are in those institutions. And I specifically didn't use the word disciple. I believe discipleship develops as a result of that mentoring when the relationship is built. But I'm talking about really mentoring and helping these kids understand not just life skills, but just those basic connections of what do I do in this situation? I'm having trouble with this particular relationship. How do I handle that? So I think that is very important. And Johnny even talked about family preservation. I think that is part of the whole concept of orphan care. Is how do we make sure that orphans are not created? How do we keep these families together? And that opens up a whole other realm of other ministry opportunities that can get into community development and all of that.
Yeah, just two quick comments. One is that I think you always have to remember that we're talking about something that's broken and messy. And so sometimes when we talk about things like models and best practices and those sorts of things, we forget that you're dealing with things that are broken and earthy and tragic and messy and never ideal. And so it never looks like it in the place that you're making the strategic plan or the classroom or those things. It never looks like that when you're in the field. And so the way that it works out in practice very often is much messier than that. The other thing I'd say is that one of the questions about best practice that I think we have to keep in mind is country to country, region to region, place to place, to ensure that we're not being imperialistic about the way we go about this, that the solutions have to be, we have resources, we have things, we know things, we have things that we can offer, and we have things that we can bring to bear. But place to place, the solutions that come and the way that those things happen, they need to happen appropriately within the culture there, globally, or even within our own communities within here within the states. And so there's a sense in which we balance the fact that we honor the fact that in the gospel there's neither Greek or Jew. There's a level field under the gospel, but we honor the fact that there's diversity, and that God has given us a world where there's culture and difference.
Okay. Now, a lot of these questions will really overlap, and in particular that last question, because I think in many ways the rest of the questions will kind of touch on, okay, what is best? What's the progression? What's the priority? So moving on, how can a local American church make a difference in the lives of orphans in another country and keep them in their home culture at the same time? How can you help a poor single parent stay with their child? And then last with this, is the orphan care movement doing enough to keep a parent and child together, or is there too much emphasis on intercountry adoption as the first option?
Yes.
That's right. Next.
All right. Okay. Well, that was easy.
You asked about 5 or 6 questions. The answer to the last one, is there too much emphasis on intercountry adoption as the first option? Mm-hmm. The way that's yes, there is. What's the purpose of the church? The purpose of the church is to care for those that are in need. It's to bring people to Christ and share the love of our Father. And isn't that the purpose of the church, not just in America? Shouldn't that be the purpose of every single local church everywhere in the world? So when we're thinking about how does the church care for orphans internationally, and this was asked in a very, very American focus, it was actually how can a local American church make a difference? I really want to challenge the American church to really think about local churches all around the world. How can we be empowering and equipping indigenous local churches everywhere in the world to be caring for orphans that are within their own community? How can we be helping them unite together within national movements or local movements, so we get churches that are within the same communities working together all around the world? For the American church, how can we change our thought process of mission strategy? Rather than we're Americans that are going to go in and we're going to feed, clothe, house, build fences, whatever it may be for orphanages, how can we go and truly work with the churches so they can be doing those things? How can we share our resources that we have? And I'm not talking just financial. We have many, many more resources than money. How can we share our resources of the American church with the churches, local churches everywhere in the world, to really empower them to be able to care for the children that are right there in their own backyards?
I would encourage the local church this way. I would say that you could have significant impact in the global orphan crisis. The way the movement swings, it's a little alarming, to be honest with you. It's like when the movement really picked up steam quite a few years ago, all we did was championing international adoption, which and it was because there's an emotional tug to it. It really pulled on your heartstrings, so to speak. I'm really thankful that the movement, I feel, is starting to come to the center where it needs to be, and so it's starting to think not only with its head but its heart as well. With its heart and head, and so we're going, okay, what is best practice? I think the church can have a significant impact on the global orphan crisis if it understands how to do that and do that well. And what David is saying, I think, is vitally important. We have to be committed with making partnerships in country, not with foreign agencies and foreign organizations, but with indigenous pastors and community leaders. And what we need to start thinking is how do we focus on, I think community development is vitally important. If we don't go in and say that one of the most significant issues here is poverty, and so how can we pour into this community and help really think through some very strategic and practical ways to end poverty in this area? And then we move and we start talking about family preservation. All these things are vitally important. But the one thing that I do think is a little frustrating in this pendulum that keeps swinging to and fro is that now what we're wanting to do is say the best thing for all children is to stay in their country and in their culture. International adoption, it's a terrible thing. You don't ever want to pull a black child out of Africa and put it with a white family in America. And I would say, in an ideal world, that may be right. But I would say that may not be the best course of action for this child. Rick, again, was going back that we have to understand that each community, each culture, each country is different. And so what's best for this child may not be the best for the next child. And so I would say churches can have significant impact if they're committed to community development, committed to partnering with the church there in Haiti or there in Ethiopia or wherever your church is called. Partnering, significant strategic partnerships with the people there are vitally important, and understanding that it's holistic in nature. International adoption is a piece of the puzzle. It's a very small piece of the puzzle, and where it fits, really you have to work it. You have to work that pendulum or that paradigm out with each child.
Okay, some of these questions, like I said, they overlap. I'm still going to read them because I want people to know their questions are being asked. We may simply agree that, okay, this has been covered. Let me move on. Many missionaries enter a culture with a primary task of evangelism, church planning, and just meeting general needs. If an already busy missionary begins encountering great orphan needs, how should they respond if there's no church in their area yet? We've already touched on if there is a church. What if there's no church there?
I've actually been a part of a ministry that was in a similar kind of situation. I wouldn't say there was no church, but the churches weren't really doing anything actively. with the orphanages that are there. I've talked about mentoring, and one option that I have personally seen that really has worked well is gathering people who are, even if they're not believers yet, gathering seekers who are interested in doing something good, and begin with getting local people, indigenous people, to go and mentor orphans, to go and work with them and develop these relationships. And as part of that training and preparation, we would actually share with them the biblical values that are behind it, and reach out to those volunteers that were there. And what we found out is the ones who began to do what Jesus would do and really follow what the Bible would say about going and caring for orphans, Jesus became real. He became visible. It became, oh, wow, this is part of my life. And those are now the strongest Christians that are in that community. And now they're part of churches that are, in turn, as a church, going and working with the orphanages in those communities. So that's what I would encourage any missionary to do if there was no local church.
Yeah, I'll just echo what David said. I've been teaching church planters globally for about the last 8 years, and as in that ministry, I think we create a false dichotomy, particularly in the conservative evangelical church in America, because of all the washover from the 60s and 70s and being scared of the social gospel and a lot of other things, that we've sort of bifurcated the telling of the gospel and the doing of the gospel, and really polarized that. And the deal is, watching churches be planted globally where, as you know, as the gospel is being shared, doing the gospel and telling the gospel at the same time, it's just natural. And I think we're seeing that and that's not unique to the globe. We're seeing that here. We're seeing a lot of church plants that are doing the same thing right here in our own context. But as little clusters of believers are beginning to emerge in communities, it's very natural, and it almost seems like there's kind of a natural connection that they begin to do justice. They begin to care for widows. They begin to care for orphans. They begin to care for outsiders and those that are the disenfranchised. And that's a natural outworking of the gospel. Hello, Matthew 25. Jesus didn't talking about those that are going to be a part of the kingdom. Those that Jesus says are going to be asked in are those who do those things, and that's what merits salvation. What he's saying is those who've been transformed by the Spirit, those good works are going to squeeze out because they're going to be indicative of who Christ is, and that's going to squeeze out of the life of somebody who's following Jesus as a disciple.
Okay, next question. As the evangelical adoption movement has gained steam, there have been some stark criticisms. Are there any of them that you feel are legitimate? I'll add, are there any of them you feel are not legitimate? And how should the church respond? I know we've already hit on some of these, so what would you add?
Absolutely not. We've done everything perfect. Sure. You can't read the news. You can't see cases around you of abuses and not know that there are things that have been done wrong. You can't read the Bible and not expect that there are going to be things that are going to be done in the name of Jesus out of selfishness and out of self-interest, and for wrong motive, and that there are going to be wolves among the sheep. That's to be expected. We have to hold ourselves to a higher standard. We always have to be on guard. And one of the things that I think we have to acknowledge is that there have been things that have happened as a part of this movement where people have, with great heart, but with very little sense at times, have rushed in and done things that have really been unadvisable.
Can you be specific about when you're talking about wolves among sheep? What exactly are some of the things that would happen?
We know that there are children that have been trafficked. We know that there are children that have been stolen from parents and have been brokered. Mm-hmm. We know that there are people that have abused the system. And we have to be better than that. You know, I mean, if there's anyone that ought to hold themselves above reproach, it ought to be those that claim the name of Christ. If there's anybody that ought to insist on policies and ought to insist on the things that keep us above reproach, it ought to be us. If there's anybody that ought to be, you know, not paying bribes and cutting corners, it ought to be us. And if we do, shame on us. You know, and that ought to be, you know, that ought to be the last word. Now, I will say that there are criticisms that I think are baseless and are completely unfounded. I think there are criticisms that are leveled like that the basis of the move toward transracial adoptions is somehow us trying to heal or gloss over a racist past. I think that's rubbish. I've got a new book out that came out this week, and I address it. I talk about it. I'm not going to talk about it in depth here, but I think there are theological reasons. I think there are reasons that we can do that and we can do it well. And I don't think we ignore race. I don't think we ignore cultural difference, but neither do I think we have to respect it to the degree that we say that transracial adoption is something that we don't do or we never do. But I also don't believe, and I think it's folks many times from outside the church that are taking pot shots because they find it easy to criticize, and I think it's unfair. There's been some very fair criticism, and we need to listen to that fair criticism. We need to grow from it. We need to learn from it, and we need to become better from it. If we become bitter from it and we turn our back on it, shame on us.
Well, how should the church respond? I think it should respond swift and quick. The church should be committed first and foremost in doing orphan care to the best practices. That's why we're having this forum this morning. We should be committed to the best practices, what is best for these children. And when legitimate criticism is laid against the church, then we need to address that. We need to say, okay, are we missing the mark here? And if so, we're committed to fixing the problem. So the church, again, should lead the charge in going, yes, there is corruption. Yes, there are some terrible practices that are taking place right now. And what we're going to do, we're going to lead the charge in stomping those things out. So I think it should be swift. I think it should be quick. But the church, again, plays a vital role in saying we want what is best.
Okay, next question. Most of it has been answered, but I want you to listen to this. Quite often, children who still have a parent are placed for adoption primarily because of the poverty and inability to provide. Shouldn't a Christian's first option be to provide social and financial assistance to preserve the family? Why is such family preservation and reunification assistance frequently not available or offered in many intercountry adoptions involving Christians or Christian agencies? I think the last part, maybe you would have something, I'm not sure.
It's difficult.
I don't know that I can speak for, I don't know that any of us can speak for agencies or, why. I think one of the things that I'll tell you is that I think we're seeing many more, even agencies that are engaged in international adoption that are beginning to do more and more of this type work. And so we're beginning to see that that many agencies are not interested merely in the work of adoption, but they're saying that we want to be more holistic in what we do, and we want to care for children, and have a more holistic approach, and we're not not so narrowly focused. That's an anecdotal observation. I can't put any data behind that, but that's just sort of walking the halls and observations in conferences and places where people and agencies gather and those sorts of things. I'll tell you and this again, it's messy. And so it's hard to make theoretical pronouncements and then say this applies in every case, everywhere, every time. But I'll tell you, poverty should never be the reason that a child has to leave their family. Never. It just shouldn't be, and that should be a standard. That should be a goal. That should be something that we should work toward.
I think some of the other, another piece of, especially the way the question was asked, was why is family preservation and reunification assistance not available or offered in many inter-country adoptions? I think, at least from the experience that I've had around the world, it actually is. You just don't hear about it here. Specifically, if your focus, if your focus is on inter-country adoptions, that's what your communication with those agencies are. And you may not know that there's other divisions of those agencies and other partnerships of those agencies that really are focused on reunifying. A lot of the people that I travel all around the world, work with ministries that are all around the world, and as I speak to people who are directing children's homes and orphanages, a great many times their first priority is to get that child back in the family, and they are working with those. So I believe this is beginning to happen. I really do believe it's happening. I just think we don't hear about it a lot because we're so focused on the inter-country adoption
Well,
issue.
and I'm not sure also that there's not a little bit of an oversimplification in the question that poverty is the only reason. Many times there's kind of there's a layering of dysfunction, and it's not just poverty. And so there's there may be substance abuse and indifference and a bunch of other things. And so you may say that poverty is the one correctable condition, but there are multiple things that need to be corrected. And at some point, and this is where I'm telling you that I think that the hope is, in many times in reunification, the ultimate hope is bringing the gospel to bear. Because what we want to see is the life transformation of parents, but I'm telling you, it's not just about creating the right economic conditions for a parent to be able to take a child back. It's about creating the right life circumstances for them to be able to take a child back and to be able to parent well. Right. And many times we could give them the money or the means, they still aren't going to be able to parent well. Right. And maybe they don't want to. Yeah. In some cases, a lot of social orphans that we know, that we're acquainted with, they've been placed into institutions, and the reason that they've been placed there is indifference.
I think a lot of our focus is also on the global side, and I really would like to just challenge our churches here in the United States of what are we doing here within our own churches for family preservation and reunification of kids. Our churches do a great job for certain issues. We have great 12-step programs for substance abuse, but where there's other issues, are we truly offering the counseling programs, and are our church families really gathering around, wrapping our arms around these families that are in danger of breaking up? And it's messy. It's not as easy as, we're just going to have this program, it's going to take care of it. It's getting involved in people's lives and living on a daily basis with our neighbors to help them, and it's tough. But I think that's something that the church needs to be doing.
And I think what you just said, though, you said it's messy, and I think that's where churches have got to really evaluate what we're about. Mm-hmm. Because, man, it doesn't fit in sermon prep. It doesn't fit in all the programs and all that's going to happen. It's messy, and so again, I'll talk about our city, but man, we got 5,600 homeless women and children in Memphis, Tennessee. Those children will be removed from the care of their mom. The state is not going to allow them to live on the streets. The likelihood of those children being reunified with their moms slim to none. We as the church have got to do something, right? 56 of those moms got moved into apartments this past year. But again, going back to just giving them an apartment does not all of a sudden make parenting viable. We've got to walk with them. We've got to come alongside them, and that takes time. It takes being taken advantage of at times. But to me, that's the gospel. That's messy. That's where it's at.
Yeah.
And we as the church have just got to, and this, man, I know today is orphan care, but I think we can evaluate everything that the church is about and say, it's complicated, it's messy, and we need to be willing to get into that.
Okay.
If I may just really quick, just a comment that I made earlier about on a global basis, our American churches empowering and equipping. If we're not doing this within our own church, if we're not really focused on family preservation within our own church and handling these really messy issues, how are we going to have the experience to be able to equip people all around the world within our missions? So I think this is a renewed focus that needs to happen.
Okay, next question, kind of a long one. In the first years of the recent orphan care movement, there was a great stress laid upon the large numbers of global orphans, i.e. the 143 million, and the possibilities for intercountry adoption to reach significant numbers of such children. Keeping in mind the following realities, two of them. One, intercountry adoptions from the U.S. have decreased from 23,000 in 2004 to 9,300 in 2012. Second one, 90% of children considered orphans live with one parent and others live with extended family. Would you agree that intercountry adoption is not the most strategic piece of the puzzle for the global orphan crisis? I think you've answered this. Okay,
Yes.
I want people to know they're being heard. Next one. What are some common false assumptions that you observe couples make when entering into the foster care adoption process?
How much time do you have?
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Man, that their way's better. That the birth parents don't love their children, or they'd be able to take care of them. How can you abuse a child, neglect a child? Man, this child was placed for adoption. They must not love them. Our way's better. I can.
There's a ton.
It's going to be easy.
Yeah.
Love's enough.
Yeah, absolutely. Which a lot of the assumptions go back to what are the motivations and expectations going into adopting and fostering.
Right.
And within the church, if we have a major weakness is, there's many, but we have a savior complex.
Right.
That we are saving these children. They are in a tough spot. They're in a rough situation, and we are saving. There's only one savior, and we are not in this room, right? And so, but play that out. If your motivation, if you feel like, man, Jesus loves orphans, I should love orphans, and I'm going to save, and I'm going to, go in and rescue. I'm a rescuer. I'm going to rescue this kid. If that's my motivation, then the flip side of that is how it plays out in your home is, I rescued you, so you should be grateful for this home you're in. You should be grateful for the roof over your head. You should be grateful for this bed. You should be grateful. And that's so far from where we need to be. And so,
I like what Dr. Russ Moore says. He says if that's your mentality, then you need to get a puppy.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
Adopt a puppy. I think this is vitally important, and we as the church have to be committed to effectively educating and teaching our church members that orphan care, this is what orphan care is. It's difficult, it's hard, there's nothing glamorous about it. You may have a cute Christmas card, but the 11 months getting to that Christmas card is going to be hard, and so education is key. I don't want to demise or diminish people's motives. I just want to make sure that they're coming from the right spot and that they're thoroughly educated on the process they're about to get in. Because if they're not, 6 months into it, their whole entire lives can be a train wreck. And then they're contemplating, well, what do I do with this kid? Do I keep it? And so motives are vitally important. We've seen it hundreds of times. I mean, there was stories in the news all the time, sending this child back to Russia, sending this child back to Ukraine, or this rehoming stuff that takes place. And I think that's done because these people were not thoroughly educated. They didn't weigh what they were about to get themselves into. They weren't connected to a community that's encouraging them, teaching them. And so that's why we as the church have to be committed to education.
This may be the thing that gets a water bottle thrown at me, but I'm gonna say something, and this is probably going to be a little bit controversial. I think from the theological perspective, we probably have overplayed our hand a little bit with regard to the theology of adoption and the connection to earthly adoption. And here's the deal, and I don't think they're unconnected. It's just the fact that I think we have to realize that anytime we make an analogy breaks. You know, if you're trying to, you make an analogy of the Trinity and you start talking about the three phases of water or whatever, it's going to break, right? I know you guys, anybody in here that has, I mean, I'm talking to a bunch of seminary students, and all of you just retched when I made that analogy because you went, oh, that's terrible. Well, I mean, it's sort of the same thing because at the end of the day, we've acknowledged we're not God. And so there is, yes, is there a glimmer and a reflection of God's adoption of us in Christ in what we do and the relationship that we have with our kids if we're adoptive parents? Absolutely. But there's also a glimmer and a reflection of the fact that sometimes we stink as parents and we're failures. And we're not God. And we don't show God off very well in the way that we parent. But there's also some stuff that doesn't work and it doesn't fit because how we got here is as a result of brokenness on both sides to some degree. And so it's not a one for one exchange. Now the beauty in all this is that there's absolutely no way that we can tell the story of how God built our family that we don't have an open door to be able to tell the gospel. And I love that. And I love that that's a part of our story, and I love that it's a part of our children's story. I'm grateful to God for that. But at the end of the day, we adopted because we love kids and we want to be parents. And we want to love kids. And if you don't adopt because you love kids and you want to be parents and you want to invest deeply and you acknowledge that it's going to be hard and there's brokenness and it's going to be difficult and that you need every bit of grace that God's going to extend to you and to them. And you need everybody that you can get around you in community to support you. Don't do it.
Okay.
I think there's another false assumption just within some people, and that is that a child that is living in poverty overseas, it would be much better off if they're living in a middle-class American household because of all the stuff that we have. And I think we need to look at, let's just put it this way, a child that is completely without parents is better off in a family with parents. It has nothing to do with the economic status of the household that they're in. There's a great story to this, and there's a ministry that's in Kenya and Ethiopia that's doing a really fantastic job of helping selected orphanages transition into what they call child protection centers. And they're partnering with some local churches and pastors and helping to recruit foster parents from within those local churches to volunteer to bring these children in as their kids out of the orphanage, out of the institution, into their homes. But the orphanage institution social workers are then being trained to rethink how the cases are handled, as instead of handling a case of a child that's living in that institution, they're handling the case of a child that's being fostered somewhere else. And so the kids come back in. And there's a great story of one of the children that comes back in from a home which is pretty much a small hut with a dirt floor, and coming back in to where the orphanage, they have a bed and it's clean and there's good food and everything and that they would need. And the child says, I don't want to go back there. I want to be with mom and dad. sleeping on the dirt floor, but it's mom and dad. I think we need to keep that in mind and not let our own cultural presuppositions enter into that.
Okay, next question. How can the church best support those involved in the adoption/foster care system?
I think the church right now is oversimplified. I think we've focused primarily on helping families, and I don't know if I'm answering this right, but I think we've focused on just aspects of it. And so I think when I think about foster families, we need to be able to walk with them pre-placement. How do we best prepare them to bring a child into their home? How do we walk with them once the child is in their home? Same for adoptive families. We need to prepare our staff. How does that 4-year-old that just came in from Ethiopia, what does that look like for a children's ministry? What does that 13-year-old that just came in from foster care look like in a youth ministry? I think, it talks about how do we help social workers? Again, social workers that work for the state are usually overworked and underpaid. And so I think a lot of times, it's like the church, we just discovered James 1:27, and we feel like now we're the experts, and we're going to go down to the Department of Children's Services, and they're going to just bow at our feet and open the doors and want us to come in. The Department of Children's Services exists because the church didn't do what it was supposed to do however many years ago, right? And so I think we need to come in humbly. I think we need to come alongside social workers. A great example, there was an event we held for foster kids, and churches were excited about having this event. You know what that meant for a social worker? That December the 15th on a Saturday, they had to work. They weren't home with their family, or they weren't able to go Christmas shopping. They had to spend half a day Saturday working. And so how do we come alongside them? How do we support them? How do we, thanks for working that half a day for the churches to throw a Christmas party for some foster kids. There's just a lot we can do. I think the church, again, we've got to if we're going to get serious about this, this is not just us making a video to show on Sunday mornings. It's not just us saying, we're going to raise some money to help a family adopt, and once they bring that child home, we're going to be at the airport holding some banners, and then we're out, and we've got to come along. We've got to do the heavy lifting, and that's what the church right now is not. I'm just speaking from a pastoral perspective. I just don't feel like we're doing the heavy lifting that we need to be doing.
We have to be intentional. Orphan care doesn't happen just by nature. So the church and the way in which we structure ourselves, and even the ministries that we do, or the systems and processes that we put in place, I know most of you don't care about that, but it's vitally important that we're intentional in creating a culture that is open, welcoming, and supportive. If we don't have boots on the ground, if we don't have resources in place, if there's not a official process in which these families look to in order to get support, they're going to fall through the cracks. They're going to be hurt along the way. And so what can churches do? They can be intentional, and they can be committed to creating a culture in the context of their church that is that's very opening and welcome to people that are different than us. We can't be so naive to think that, it's just, they have the same needs and concerns that we do, because they don't. When a foster child who's 13 comes into your megachurch youth group and everybody's white, then there's going to be that difficulty there. But if we've created a culture that's open and welcoming, it makes it easier for them to integrate within the church, develop significant relationships, open to the gospel being preached over them, and enter into a community that's loving and caring as just to a family that's brought them in. And so intentional and creating a culture that's open, I think, is vitally important for churches.
Two other things that I would say. One, we're really good in the church about putting people in sort of boxes of sameness and sort of aiming to the middle. And so things like we have to up our game in things like special needs ministries, because so many of the kids that are coming in from in foster care, kids that are coming into adoptive families have needs that are they're differences, and they don't fit in the box. And in the church, I'm just going to be honest with you, we're doing a lousy job of figuring out how to how to minister to them. And so we've got to, if we're gonna call people to do this, and we're gonna tell them we're gonna be here for you, we have to figure out how to flex to address that. The other thing we have to do, I think, is we've got to think about foster kids, and we've got to think about adoptees. I think even in us, this conversation's been a little bit postured to think about the adults, but it's not thinking directly sometimes about the kids, and the kids as they mature and old, they get older. But even things like within our classes and our small groups and our thing, sometimes our language and stuff has to change, and the way we say and do things, because we don't think about the stuff we say that's hurtful, the stuff we say that's goofy, the stuff we say that's exclusive, that puts kids on the outside. I mean, I've got a 17-year-old daughter that's been in the States for 3 years, and I know those moments where she's gracious, but I know those moments where she feels like she's sitting a little bit on the outside. And it's because people haven't intentionally done it, but they've done it, and it's not. It's just inattention, and so we just have to wrestle with those things, I think.
Okay. Do you have an opinion, or can you point to research that supports the idea that orphanages are best run by individuals within the community and culture that the orphanage operates? Please try to give consideration to the various roles ranging from administration to house parents.
I mean, I think ideally, yeah, you would want an orphanage that's run by the people there in their culture and context. Ideally, I think that's the best practice. In theory, it just doesn't necessarily happen in a lot of context. And so, I mean, you ask, who's the most qualified to run an orphanage? I think the person who is going to love, support, care, provide protection for that child, whether they look like that child or not. And so in an ideal world, you want Haitians caring for Haitians. You want Ethiopians caring for Ethiopians. But in a lost, dying, broken, sinful world, sometimes that just doesn't happen. And so I'm not going to walk up to the American family who's sold everything and moved to whatever country and said, we're gonna spend the rest of our lives serving these children. I would say if you've been thorough in how you've set this thing up, if you're doing what's best for this child, if you're loving and supporting this child, if there's no abuse taking place, if this and that's happening, then God bless you, and may He bless your work here. And so, yeah, ideally, again, you want Haitians caring for Haitians, but in a broken world, sometimes that just doesn't happen.
I think, and I'm gonna go just maybe a little contrary, and just say that I think many times I think we just take an angle that we don't respect the giftedness and the talent and the ability that God's invested in nationals. And we sort of look at it from our perspective, and we're fearful that we're gonna hand resources or things to nationals, and we just think they're not gonna do well with it because they're not gonna do with it what we would do with it. And so we're frightened to let go.
Like, who defines what's best for the child?
Right.
Right. Well, it's got to be.
It's got to be what we think is best. And so, sometimes we have to be willing to let go of some of those biases and say, we trust, and to enter into a partnership of trust and temper our expectations. I think sometimes some of the best models I've seen is where people go, but they, their goal is to work themselves out of a job. That they're doing leadership development and creating in order to hand off, or they're training to fill in gaps. Things like where there's orphanages where there's or children's homes where there's not been a history of nurture. And where things like essential development for infants, where there's not been holding and eye gaze and those sorts of things, and so the things that are set in the very building blocks for trust haven't been there, and they've been very regimented in the way kids are getting fed and changed, but they're in their crib 24 hours a day without human touch. Somebody comes in and trains those skills, and they show them what to do and how to do, but they invest those skills in nationals and then move out, and let the nationals do with a minimal investment.
Yeah, disconnected from the community is I don't think that's a good idea ever. Disconnected from the community, and so if community development, investing in locals is not a part of the plan, then I don't think it's ever a good idea.
Some of the research that is beginning to come out right now, it really has to deal with kids that have grown up within trauma, that have had trauma in their life. And any of these children that we're talking about have trauma in their life. So the caregivers really do need to be effectively trained in trauma-based caregiving. And this has been something that in the past has not been very well disseminated around the world, even necessarily here within the states, even among potentially adoptive parents here in the states. And there are more and more resources that are beginning to be available and are beginning to be disseminated right now, ministries that are totally focused on this, on training people here in the U.S. and training others internationally to help with that. So I'm not answering the specific question, but I think the people who are best equipped to care for children are people who are best equipped to care for children, and we need to be providing that equipping.
That's good.
Okay, from the perspective of the children being served, do you find it is beneficial or constructive to perpetually send mission teams to the ministry, especially if the cultures vary dramatically?
May I?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think a lot of what we do in sending in missions is just goofy. My friend Chris Marlowe that leads Help One Now, I'll quote him in saying, why is it that we would send the CEO of a Fortune 500 company to go do missions and have him carry bricks in a wheelbarrow from one place to another all week and think that that's doing a great thing for the kingdom? That somebody who creates wealth all the other 51 weeks of a year, and he does that, and God's given him the skill to do that, and then we send him halfway around the world to do kingdom work, and we say, take everything that you know and everything that you can do and put that on the shelf. Now haul a wheelbarrow full of bricks or sand from one place to another all week, and that's the best thing that we can ask you to do. And so, I think the question that you have to ask, and maybe the question that we're asking in a wrong way, is what is it that these teams can come and do? What is it that they do that they don't get in the way, that's essential, that they bring skill to bear, that adds value, that doesn't short circuit the care and the appropriate care that's going on in the environment. I mean, David talked about the fact that you're dealing with trauma-based care. You're dealing with the need to build attachment with kids in the environments that they're in. It's not helpful to bring people in from the outside and have them come crash in for a week and then run out and go away and never show back up again. Yeah. We don't need to be volunteerists.
What's the book, When Helping Hurts?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's where Everyone should start there.
But are there appropriate things that we can do where we can come in and bring resources to bear, and we can take the things that we have, we can take the things that we know, we can take the things that God's given to us and invested to us, and we can take those things to the field and we can bring them to bear? Absolutely.
Sure.
We just have to do those things in a way that we just need to use some common sense.
Right. It's not the fact that we don't send mission teams. We just rethink what we're doing and how we're sending them.
Yeah.
Again, I feel like I understand maybe where this question's coming from. Is it not just better for that person to stay home and send the $2,000 to them? I'd say no, not necessarily. And so I would say, yeah, we send teams. It's a part of who we are as Christians. The commandment to go is still the same, but if all we're going to do is land in an orphanage for a week and kick a soccer ball, then yeah, save your $2,000 and stay home. But if we're going to be intentional about using the talents and passions that God has given our people and say, well, how can we utilize that on the field there to develop community, to pour into leaders, to do this, to do that, then let's do that. And let's just not go in and kick soccer balls and hand lollipops out, because essentially what you're doing is you really undermine what we're trying to accomplish long term. Because, again, you're leaving the child. They go through that whole, I just lost another friend. It's like, oh, it happens every other week. I lose another friend. And so it just perpetuates the problem. And then if you see a child run up and you hand them a lollipop on the street, what you've done is, if they do have a father or mother, you've just undermined them, because it takes that father all year to earn enough money to be able to buy them something like that to give it to them for Christmas. But every time they see this person, and so, I just think we don't stop sending teams. We just rethink how we're doing it.
Yeah. Okay, so I did the unthinkable. I fired a mission team one time. Yeah.
Pagan.
Well, very well-intentioned, extremely well-intentioned. A group of ladies from a church that went to an orphanage in Ukraine to give Christmas gifts, and they would go every year, and the church would invest a great deal of money buying these wonderful Christmas gifts here in the States, wrapping them up, shipping them to Ukraine, and they would go to a couple of different orphanages and go and hand them out, and the kids are very happy. And they would go home and say, we've been praying for our kids, we did great things for our kids, and they'd go back the next year and do the same thing. And the problem is there were no local believers or resources that were engaged in this effort, except for a translator that was going in with them. When I suggested to them, well, not suggested, I told them that in order to continue to do this, they really needed to be engaged with this group of believers that we already had going into that orphanage on a regular basis, that were developing these relationships with the kids. And oh, by the way, the Christmas gifts are awesome, but I don't want you to give them to the kids. I want these local Ukrainians to give them to the children, so that would in turn further develop their relationship. These Americans said no, and they actually said, well, do we have to pay for the hotel for these other mentors that were local to come in? I said, yeah, absolutely. This is your mission. So yeah, and they absolutely refused to, and so I refused to work with them. Let me tell you why. In preparation for the work there, we were doing a weekend retreat with about 40 Ukrainian and Russian mentors, Christian mentors that were coming in, and we were in the process of transitioning the ministry to this mentoring and discipleship ministry. And I began by talking about, if you were just with us before to do camps, but you're not interested in really working, this is talking to Ukrainians specifically, but you're not really interested in going in, then we really appreciate your help in the past, but we'd rather not work with you again in the future. This is all about really caring for these children on a regular basis and developing a long-lasting relationship and working with the children. And they all said yes. And this one guy who was really quiet, he stood up, and in Russian, he's just really loud. He says, "David's right." And I kind of jumped and said, what is he talking about? And he said, "I know what he's talking about because I am one of these kids. None of you know me, but I grew up in one of these orphanages, and here's what he said. Every time you would come to visit and you would not come back for another year, you broke my heart all over again, and you abandoned me just like my parents did. That struck me to my core, and so my answer to this question is, if we're sending mission teams, but there are not local believers that are continuously entering into those relationships with the children, stop sending mission teams, please, because you're hurting these kids and breaking their hearts all over again, and showing them that Christians, while they may care for a week, you don't care for them the other 51 weeks out of the year.
Question 14. What advice and resources would you suggest for helping a husband and wife seek to be on the same page regarding foster care and or adoption? Is there any process or time frame recommendation?
Pray. You better be on the same page, though. I mean, if you're not on the same page on where you're going to jump in, you're going to have bigger issues. So, I mean, that's oversimplifying, but I mean, y'all got to be on the same page.
And I wouldn't just let that pass you. I mean, we're church folk, and so we often hear people say pray, and we're like, oh, okay, yeah. So could you get on to the real advice? That is it. I mean, prayer is the work. So what is Linda Raven here? If week in prayer, week everywhere. If guys, everything that we've talked about, if it's not saturated in prayer, then at the end of the day, it's probably going to fail. And so we've got to be committed to prayer as a family unit. And so
I was that guy. I mean, you know, I was that guy that didn't get it. And my wife was convinced and convicted and prayed. You know, she didn't leave open Bibles around the house. She didn't write it on the mirror in lipstick. She didn't place Post-it notes around the house. I mean, none of that stuff. She prayed quietly, and God did immense things in my life. And I'd love to tell you the story sometime. So let's get a cup of coffee.
Well, I mean, you're at some point that child's going to be in your home, and you're going to parent, right?
Yeah.
And so, you know, so often we focus on I want to bring a child into my home. I want to bring a child into my home, and that's all we focus on. Well, that's the easy part. As hard as that part is, sometimes that's the easy part. And if you're not on the same page, you got 18 years to raise a child, and that's going to be a hard 18 years.
Well, and you don't want one spouse or the other going, I came into this reluctantly, and this is your fault.
yeah.
So this has to be something that you're both convinced and convicted that God's led you to.
And I would say 9 out of 10 times it's the husband that needs to be brought up to speed. From my experience, from what I have seen. That could be different in other parts of the country.
Okay, last question. We're not going to be able to get to all of them. But what are the best ways to structure a culture of discipleship between the children and the staff of orphanages, i.e. house parents, administrators, etc.?
Well, I mean, to quote one of the greatest Baptists of all time, next to John the Baptist being Charles Spurgeon, he would often say, was known for caring for many orphans and had really large orphanages, but his philosophy behind how he structured it is that these orphans need to be broken up into small family units with a primary care provider, most of the time being a woman. And so he would say, while yes, there may be 150 children here, we've broken them up into very small family units, and they have one person who is constantly providing for them. And then he would always say, and as well, they're always in the earshot of the gospel. And so if you're going to structure an orphanage, I would say that it has to be very strategic in the way in which you structure your children. It needs to be small, and it needs to be gospel-centered. You probably can speak to that.
Well, I agree with a lot. I agree with a lot of what you said. There are situations where a larger group is required. There's I know a great ministry operating out of Kyiv that is taking kids off the streets, and they first have to go through about a 4-month it could be up to 4 months, depends on the child, a process of really preparing them to re-enter into a family-based setting. A lot of these kids aren't ready for that. And so they work through that in that, like I said before, in a crisis situation, pull them off the street. But that is continually done in a larger group with love and with scripture. But then as soon as possible, they do put them into a small family-based setting with a mom and a dad, right there on the same, they have actually apartments set up to where they operate as a family within their own apartment, and then they participate in larger group training and life skills and things, while they also go out to school and other social activities. So I agree, being as close to a family-based environment as possible within that context, I think is important. And then you can share that discipleship and share that your faith with them.
The only other thing I'd add is maintain a connectedness to the local church.
Okay.
Absolutely.
All right. All right, our time is up. Please join me in showing your appreciation for these guys. Thank you so much for coming. I would invite you, if you have time, please drop by the Global Center. We do have free coffee. You can check out our resources in there. Also, if you would like to be on the email list for future Global Center events, Michelle is back there. Raise your hand, Michelle. Point towards the sheet of paper. They can sign it. Oh, she's pointing out back there. And thank you, Michelle, for doing so much to make this happen. Without her, I'd be fired soon. And our Global Center staff as well. Thank you so much. Everyone have a great day.